Anna Zivarts is a visually impaired parent, a non-driver, and the author of this book, When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. Anna directs the Disability Mobility Initiative at Disability Rights Washington, where she launched the Week Without Driving Challenge. Before working in the disability community, Anna spent 15 years as a communications strategist for labor and political campaigns. She worked in the LGBT and HIV/AIDS project at the ACLU, and she co-founded a New York City-based communications and storytelling firm called Time of Day Media. Anna earned her undergraduate and master's degrees from Stanford University. Our city is currently, as most of you know, undergoing rapid change right now. So Anna, for your information, we are currently expanding Mayo Clinic with a multi-billion-dollar investment that will soon change our streets and our infrastructure here in Rochester forever. So the conversations like the ones that we're about to have tonight, our votes and our advocacy, all are very important for shaping our community's future. And as an ophthalmologist, I have really hard conversations with patients all the time. Often people are losing their vision and we have to have the hard driving conversation. And they say things like, "Doctor, how do I give up driving when there really are no reliable options otherwise?" So thank you for being a part of this conversation. And Anna, thank you for being here and helping us all be better advocates for our neighbors who no longer can drive, have never been able to drive, or who chose not to drive for whatever the reason. So please join me in welcoming Anna Zivarts.
Hi, thank you all so much for having me here tonight. It's really an honor to be here in Rochester and to be with you all. I know it's been a rough couple of weeks on a lot of fronts, and I do feel honored that you've taken the time out of your lives right now to be here in this room with us tonight to talk about building a better future. I'm going to start, and I'm going to do my best to visually describe the slides that I'm presenting for my own practice of accessibility and to make sure everyone in the room can access this material. And so this first image is something that gives me a lot of hope. First of all, there's an image of the book cover, When Driving is Not an Option, and on it there's an image, it's like a hand-drawn image of some people with different abilities waiting for a bus at a bus stop. And among those people, there's older people, there's younger people. And it was actually drawn by a friend of mine who also is low vision, also is visually impaired. And I'm really honored she was able to do the art for the cover of the book. The image behind it on the screen is of my kid and another kid from my block. And they are riding the bus. And they were riding the bus because I was taking them to the library. Because a neighborhood kid didn't have a library card yet, and I wanted to make sure that she went there and got one. And this image gives me a lot of hope because it's, so many of the things that I hope we can all have in our communities someday, that we can know and trust our neighbors, that we have accessible public transit that's within walking and rolling distance, and that we have places to go, public resources like libraries that all of us can get to. So I'm keeping that hope in mind in these moments of challenge that we're going through right now. So I want to talk a little bit about myself and how I got here and why me, why here right now, where did I come from? I grew up in Washington State, so I was born near our state capital, and I was born with a condition called nystagmus, and it's a neurological condition. It makes my eyes shake a little bit all the time, and that reduces my visual acuity. And so I have my white cane here. I use it sometimes. I don't necessarily need it for navigation, but it's very helpful for me to signal to other people that I can't see them. So I use it especially at conferences because people expect that I'm going to be able to recognize them across the room or read name tags, and I can't do that. I also use it a lot in airports because I've gotten in a lot of trouble with TSA where they'll be like, "Go that way," and they'll point and I won't go the right way, and I've had some incidences. So I use it when I travel. And another, big impact of my vision is not being able to drive. And that has really shaped the way that I access the world because our country is so car dependent. And so on the screen, there's two images. The first is of me learning how to ride a bike as a kid, and I feel very fortunate. My mom was a big cyclist. She'd biked across the country in the 70s, and she was insistent that I was going to learn how to bike. And so despite it being a little trickier with my balance and my vision, I learned how to bike, and biking has been a great form of transportation for me. That picture was taken at my friend's house. She lived in the city where there were sidewalks, and I was super jealous of that because I grew up on a road, and this image on the right is the road that I grew up on. And it's a rural road. There's no sidewalks. It's surrounded by tall trees. There's no shoulder. It's about 10 miles outside of town. And so growing up there, I felt really isolated and alone. I didn't know other people who couldn't drive or other adults, and that felt really hard to me. And so I went to the DMV when I was 16, and I tried to pass the vision test, and I failed. And then I still thought I was going to be able to drive, and so I had my friend teach me how to drive in her mom's truck, and I ran that truck up a tree in a parking lot, and that scared me, and that made me realize, okay, I am a non-driver. This is the world I'm going to have to inhabit. And that led me to the work I'm doing now through a long and circuitous path, which you heard a little bit about in my bio. I want to pause for a second and have you all think about who you know in your own lives who are non-drivers. And maybe that's you, maybe that's your children who do not yet have their driver's license, maybe because they're not old enough, or maybe because they're choosing not to. Maybe that's people in your family who are aging out of driving. Maybe it's people with disabilities. Maybe it's people who can't afford to drive, can't afford a license, have a suspended license, don't have documentation for a whole host of reasons. And the image on the screen is an image of some folks waiting at a bus stop. This is, I believe, in Austin, Texas. I was on a bus and I was taking pictures outside the window. And so, the second you start sort of noticing and thinking about transportation access, you start to notice all the people who don't have access to driving. So Eric's going to help me here to call on some people. This is going to be interactive, to share who you know, whether that's yourself or someone else in your lives who doesn't drive, who is a non-driver. And if you want to share anything about what their experience is of how they access their communities, that'd be great too. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. So this person just shared about how they have a condition that prevents them from driving right now and how difficult it is to access transit, especially on the outskirts of town, crossing highways with transit frequency. And I started thinking as you were sharing, when I was wanting to write this book, one of the first things the publisher said to me was, well, all your stories are from Washington State, and that won't apply to the rest of the country. And I think as I've gotten out and gotten the chance to tour the country with this book, just how you hear the same things every single place, right? That the buses don't run frequently enough, that the highways are too hard to cross, that it's really hard, especially towards the outskirts of town. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. All right, let's do one or two more people. Yes, oh my gosh, so this person was sharing about how the safety concerns, right, of not feeling safe riding transit or walking places that feel empty or, scary at night. And it's happened to me the other night with my kid getting off the bus. Someone got off the bus with us who, it just didn't feel good. And I could see the bus driver was trying to stop this other person from following us by shutting the doors, and it didn't quite work. And there's just that feeling, right, of not feeling secure in space is something that deters you from taking a lot of trips. And then when you have to, that's stress for sure. All right, I'm going to keep talking, and we'll have more chances to talk in a minute. So I want to touch sort of broadly on the different categories of non-drivers that I talk about in my book, and that you probably will recognize all these people in your own lives as well. The first category, and this is really the heart of the book because it's the world that I work in. I work for a disability rights nonprofit in Washington State, and so interact with many people with disabilities. And so the first category is people with disabilities who can't drive because of their disabilities. And this can be, I think of this broadly too, right? It's not just people who identify as disabled, because that word disability still has so much stigma that, I didn't identify as disabled for many years until my mid-30s, really, and I got connected through Twitter at that point to the disability community and started being able to feel like, it was a place that I could identify with and wanted to identify with. So, all kinds of disabilities can prevent driving. We'd heard about diabetes, vision disabilities, epilepsy, other health conditions. People can be able to drive some days and not other days, right? It can fluctuate. People with mobility disabilities too, right? Maybe you can drive, but you can't afford a car that has hand controls. And there's an image here of Erica, who lives in Seattle. She's using a power chair here, and she needs to use her power chair to get around. She can drive, actually, and she could even drive a car without hand controls, like a regular car, but she can't afford a car that allows her to bring her power wheelchair with her, a wheelchair accessible vehicle. And so if she wants to go anywhere and get out of the car, she has to take transit. So I consider her a non-driver as well. So yeah, lots of different kinds of disabilities. Every time I talk to different crowds of people, I feel like I hear other stories, other experiences, traumatic brain injuries, many different kinds of things that can make driving unsafe or uncomfortable. One example of this, of someone who, I would perhaps consider disabled, but she never would have used that word for herself, is my grandma. She's pictured here on the bottom left, and she had a heart condition that would cause her periodically to pass out. But she lived in rural southern Indiana, and there was no way she was going to leave the farm where she lived and where her animals were, and she wanted to live there. And the nearest town was 40 miles away 40 miles away. And so she kept driving, and she kept driving even though she kept on passing out, and people would find her, in her car on the side of the road, sort of driven off into a cornfield somewhere. And that was what she did until she finally passed away in her sleep, thankfully not hurting anyone in the process. But there are many people who age out of driving safely or comfortably, or age out of driving at night. My parents are at that point in their lives now. And so older non-drivers are a big segment of non-drivers. Then there are younger non-drivers, people too young to drive, obviously people under the age of 16. And there's an image here of my kid and another kid on our block waiting for the school bus. And we have created sort of this whole transportation system with school transportation focused on younger non-drivers who can't yet drive themselves. And we value their access to schools, right? That's why we fund bus transportation. Maybe not enough, but it's funded, right? In many places, because we recognize that there's not always a parent who can take them there. There's not always a parent who has the transportation access or the time to provide that transportation to school, and it's still really valuable for kids to get there. And I just wish we had that same commitment to everyone in our communities, right? That we recognize the value of everyone's need to get places and be connected. Another big group of non-drivers are people who can't afford to drive or who can't afford to maintain or own a vehicle for a whole host of different reasons. For us in Seattle, this became really, really visible during the pandemic when bus ridership in our city collapsed, right, among choice riders, people who were white-collar commuters, a lot of tech workers. We had a lot of routes focused on bringing folks from the suburbs into our downtown. They were high-speed routes. They were pretty comfortable. They were very crowded. They generated a lot of income for our transit agency. And that ridership just went poof overnight as the pandemic started. What didn't go away was the people on the routes that served low-income communities and communities of color, immigrant communities in our South End. And so this image on the middle is some folks on the bus during the pandemic. This was my bus route, and it really stayed pretty busy the whole through all of the pandemic because people didn't have another choice. People were using that bus because that was their only option for transportation. And so that happened in a lot of transit systems throughout our country during the pandemic, is that visibility of who really needed those systems to go places, who didn't have other choices that were feasible. And then finally, the last big category of non-drivers are what I consider sort of choice non-drivers. And choice, I think, it's a slope, right? There's different sort of categories of choice, but people who, perhaps have a driver's license, but, would rather not spend that money on a car because money's tight and they want to use that money for something else, so they're going to figure out how to bike and walk and take transit places. People for environmental reasons, for climate reasons, for health reasons, are choosing not to own cars. And this is a big group, and this is an increasingly big group among young people. And this part makes me really excited. There's a big group of people in their late teens and early 20s who are choosing not to get driver's licenses at the same rates that they did in my generation in the 90s. So when I was a teen in the 90s, about 50% of 16-year-olds got driver's licenses at 16. Now that's down to about 25%, big decrease. And those decreases, not quite as dramatic, but they maintained up until people in that 20 to 25 year age range too. So that gives me a lot of hope. So altogether, non-drivers are about a third of the US population. And this is a number that I think is surprising to people, and I do get pushback, right? People are like, it can't really be that many people. But the reality is you take together everyone who doesn't drive, whether that's by choice, because of disability, because of age, because of income, we are about a third of the population. Now, I wish we had better numbers on this. The numbers we have aren't perfect because there aren't really good measures. We measure, how many cars per household, but that doesn't really tell you who has access to that car within a household. We look at driver's licenses, but there are people who drive without licenses. There also are a lot of people who have a license who can no longer drive or cannot afford a car. And so those aren't perfect measures either. In places where they've done a little bit deeper digging, so in Washington State and Wisconsin, the state DOTs did research, and in Wisconsin, it's about 31% of the population are non-drivers. In Washington State, researchers found it's about 30% funded through our state legislature. So big numbers. I don't know the number here, and I hope it's something that someday you all have an answer for. As I mentioned before, as you start to sort of think about non-drivers and you start to look, you start to see non-drivers. And if you're a non-driver, you probably already do this. You see other people. You notice people waiting for the bus. You notice people walking down the side of the rural highway. You notice, and this image here is a path worn into the grass on the side of a highway where there's not a sidewalk. Like, you notice these signs of where people are trying to access their communities without reliable access to a vehicle. So how do non-drivers get around? This next part of the conversation, I'm going to ask some rhetorical questions, but I'm going to ask you to sort of answer them to yourself in your head. This first image is an image of Jaime Torres, and he's a non-driver from Washington State who had a traumatic brain injury. And he describes what it feels like to not be able to drive, to have to rely on others for rides, and the depression that he felt being trapped at home as a result of that. And so, I think one thing that we hear often when I talk to my own family, when I talk to other non-drivers, is people just tell us, oh, well, why don't you just ask for rides? Like, sure, you can't drive, but there's plenty of people in your world who can drive. Isn't it easy just to get rides where you want to go? And the reality is it's not. Even if you have a deep social network, even if you have a partner, even if you have kids who can drive, even if you have parents who can drive, each one of those times you need to go somewhere, you're asking a favor. And that comes that comes with a cost. That comes as a trade-off. And so I want you to think about in your own head, just think to yourself, the last time that you had to ask someone for a ride somewhere. Maybe it was to the airport or to a medical appointment if you're someone who could normally drive. And what you felt like you had to offer in exchange. And just think about that. What we see is a result of what we see as a result of non-drivers not having this kind of access, that having to rely on social connections to get places, is that the things that we give up are the things that we consider to be somewhat optional, right? Like, it might feel okay to ask someone for a favor to get to a doctor's appointment, but asking for a ride to, go out to a dinner or go out to a play or go out to a social event, that can feel much more discretionary, much more optional. And so those are the sorts of things we give up. This is some new data. I haven't actually shared this publicly before. You're my first audience that gets to see this. But we did a survey with about 70 non-drivers from Washington State, and we asked them what kinds of things that they give. What are the things they give up? What are the things they miss out on because they can't drive? And I put those questions, it was qualitative answers, so they were sort of long form, and I put them into a word cloud generator just to sort of get a sense of what are the things people are saying. And it was really shocking to me what floated to the top, though, shocking. I guess it was not surprising, but it was really clear, right? It was those sort of social engagements, friendships, this word cloud. The big words that are popping up are family, dinner, friend, meetings, social, ask, church, recreation. So those are the things that people are having to give up because they do not have access to transportation because we live in such a car-dependent society. I also then, in the same question, asked folks about what is the impact of that on your life? Like, what is the impact of not having rides to places that you need to go or not being able to get there yourself? And again, the word cloud, the big words here are social, depression, isolated, miss, work, job, find, hard, event, right? So you sort of get the idea that it is having an emotional impact on the health, the mental health of so many non-drivers. Also, we started to think a little bit about this in terms of not just what transportation, not just as the goal in itself, right? But where are you trying to get to? Where are those places and what are those places? And so this one I think is a little more interesting. We asked, what are the things that are easy for you to get to? And grocery was the big one. So that's good. I guess people need food. Also store, work, medical, shops. But then when we asked what are the things that are hard to get to, the big things were appointment. And I think this is particularly relevant to this audience here in Rochester in the context of health, access to appointments, access to medical care. In Washington State, one of the biggest challenges we hear over and over again in transportation access is access to medical care. And I think a lot of that is because our medical care is centralized in Seattle. And if you're outside of Seattle, getting into Seattle can be really difficult. And I imagine the same thing is true here, right? That rural transportation from smaller communities, transportation to here to Rochester, right, from other parts of the state, is limited. And so if you cannot drive yourself, getting to those appointments, especially if they're with specialists, can be a real challenge. So what are the things that make getting places easier so that we don't have to necessarily rely on favors, rely on friends and family, rely on asking, or if we can afford to, rely on paying for rides? Access to transit. Transit is freedom. And this is an image here of Abby Griffith. She is a blind non-driver from Washington State who grew up in a rural part of the state and had a lot of depression in high school because she was home. Her mom was a single mom. She had other siblings, and her mom wasn't able to, didn't have the time to drive her places. So Abby was stuck at home, and finally she was able to figure out how to get her own apartment in a nearby city in Vancouver, Washington, which is just across the river from Portland, Oregon. And she was thrilled that she could get herself to the grocery store, she could get herself to meet friends, that she lived close enough to the bus stop. And that freedom for her was just liberating. So thinking about in your community, maybe it's now or maybe it's in the near future, because I hear you're getting some new investments, but where does transit run? Where does it not run? How frequently does it run? And when does it not run? I think that's a big one. I know as someone who can't drive, whenever I think about moving to a city, when I left New York City, actually, I was kind of freaked out about leaving a place that had 24-hour transit. How was I going to live somewhere else? And I picked Seattle because it had the best transit in Washington State. But had I moved back to my hometown, I had friends who lived there in the blind community who described to me they couldn't get to work on time because transit didn't start running till 7 a.m., right? And if you had to be at work and your commute was longer, it wasn't going to work. Going back to that survey with the 70 respondents in the word clouds, I just thought this was interesting. When we asked people what would make things easier to get where you wanted to go, the biggest words were transport, route, more bus, service, paratransit, transit, right? Very clearly about transit access. That one floated right to the top. It's important, though, that we think of transit not as an isolated thing, right? Though as part of a larger network, and that network includes sidewalks. And I have to say, I spent some time walking around Minneapolis yesterday and then this morning, and I was pretty excited to see, while not perfect, you had a fair amount of sidewalk clearing from snow, which does not happen in Seattle. People just don't understand that concept. But understanding that these are, that if you do not have a bus stop that's wheelchair accessible, if you do not have a smooth accessible sidewalk, if there's no sidewalk at all, that bus stop becomes, the people who can use it become limited, right? You lose a lot of people who would otherwise be able to access that. And there's two images here. The image on the upper left is Crystal Monteros, who's a wheelchair user in Tacoma, Washington, and she lives across from she lives in a low-income apartment complex that's across the street from a major bus stop, but that bus stop doesn't have a sidewalk, and so it's mud. And she's in her wheelchair, so if it gets really gicky, she has to get friends to help sort of from the apartment complex come over and push her through the mud. And so she's been advocating with us for a number of years now to get a sidewalk built. It's still not built yet. It's one of those places where there's utility lines and everything got really complicated and expensive, and if they just moved the curb over a little bit, it would be easier, but that would mean taking a lane. So it's a fight. The image on the right is two other folks from Washington State, Kat and JR, and they live out in a more rural area, and we were going to visit a friend of theirs, and the bus stop near their friend's house was loose gravel, and Kat is in a power wheelchair. And so if she was to pull into that loose gravel, she would flip her chair or get stuck. And so instead of doing that, she waited on the pavement. There's no shoulder of this rural road, and there's cars going past us at like 40, 50 miles an hour. And I felt sort of obligated to stand out there with her, and it was terrifying. It was a really unpleasant situation. And there's no pad there to pull out, and the transit agency had no ADA transition plan to even sort of map out how many of bus stops in their system were like this and what the plan was to eventually get them paved. So there's a quote also here from Crystal Monteros, who says, "We need to start thinking of public transportation and sidewalks as going together instead of as two separate things. You can't use the bus stop if you can't get yourself to the bus stop." And I just think that says it all. We often, our transit departments are separate from our sidewalks, our DOTs, and we don't integrate them into the same system. We're not thinking about how do we have this connected network. Crossings are also part of this. If, and you mentioned that a second ago in your comments, the person who shared, if you have a major arterial you have to cross, if you have an on-ramp or an off-ramp, this is a highway off-ramp, and there's a group of folks here in this image trying to cross to get to a bus stop. There's also an image of my friend Micah Lusignan, who was at another on-ramp in Seattle. They're building a light rail station in the middle of this like highway cloverleaf thing, and so there's these on-ramps and off-ramps that don't have lights that pedestrians are going to kind of have to dash across, which is a really dumb idea. And I can't believe nobody stopped them from doing that. But I think the people who were building the light rail weren't really thinking about the people who are going to be using that light rail and what their experience was going to be like of getting to that station. And so Mike has said, as he was waiting here, he went over and that what he thought was an accessible pedestrian signal button to push because he's blind to cross is actually a sign that just says, "Use caution while crossing." And there's cars coming off the freeway, coming around this like blind turn at highway speeds, and he's going to have to just sort of step into their path and hope they stop to get across. So we are working. We actually got a RAISE grant through the federal government to study possible solutions. My dream is that we actually close some of these on and off ramps, and we make it less of a horrendous place for pedestrians. So thinking about in your own communities, where are those places that are difficult to cross? Where are there missing sidewalks? Where are there sidewalks that don't get cleared of snow? And there's an image here from Seattle in my neighborhood where my neighbor cleared his or her driveway. I actually don't know this particular neighbor. They perfectly cleared their driveway from snow, and they did not clear the sidewalk at all. And so the driveway is perfect, and the sidewalk is an icy mess, which for those of us who are not in a wheelchair, it's perhaps less treacherous, but if you're in a wheelchair, this becomes completely unnavigable. And in Seattle, when it snows and people don't clear, it means some of my friends get stuck in their homes for, until the snow melts, which could be 3 days, it could be 5 days. It could be more if we actually get a cold spell. So There's also an image here of Tanisha Sepulveda, who's a power chair user, and she is rolling in the street because there's no sidewalks. And y'all probably heard the news a couple weeks ago. There was a mom killed in St. Louis who was walking in the street with her kid pushing a stroller because the sidewalks weren't cleared of snow, and she got hit. So thinking about where are those places in your community that are those gaps that are almost uncrossable sort of rivers in access. I think it's important for us to also think about not just walking and rolling, but sort of thinking about broader e-mobility as an access point too. And I grouped this all together, even though I know it's not a single category, because I think it's useful to sort of think about it together. Both electric bikes, electric wheelchairs, electric scooters, regular bikes, right? These are all forms of transportation access and can be really powerful tools to get where we need to go, especially if we live in communities where the distance we need to travel are too far for us to walk for whatever reason. And so there's a quote here from Ian Mackey, who's a power chair user in Washington State, and has someone who's been working really hard in Washington State, and I know there's work on this nationally on right to repair, the ability to be able to fix your own power wheelchair without voiding the warranty. But he's also a huge proponent of getting longer lasting batteries in power wheelchairs, because a lot of them are designed to meet sort of insurance requirement minimums, but not really designed for someone who wants to be able to go out and cruise around all day without having to charge, or be able to cruise around in the rain without having things zap in the system. He says, oftentimes people's lifestyles are shaped by the equipment that they have. A family should be able to go spend the day at Disneyland and not run out of batteries. And there's an image of Ian on a trail in Washington State. He organizes these sort of long distance, fully supported, really wonderful, accessible bike rides and wheelchair rides with folks from all over the country. There's also some images of other folks using trikes and using electric bikes. As I mentioned before, I bike. It's been a great point of access for me. I've met many other low vision people who bike because we cannot drive and use it for transportation. And so I'm excited to be part of the conversation tomorrow at the e-bike policy summit to talk about how e-bikes really are a tool for access and freedom. And we need to make sure they don't get regulated in a way that excludes low vision folks and other folks with disabilities. Finally, paying for rides. I go back and forth on whether to include this slide because most of the folks that I work with can't afford to do this, or maybe only can afford to do this in an emergency. Uber and Lyft are expensive. They don't exist in more rural parts of our state, and in many communities they don't exist, or they're not reliable. If you need a wheelchair accessible cab or taxi or Uber or Lyft, you're pretty much out of luck most places. And so using that sort of system as a reliable form of transportation for many people with disabilities is not an option. And there's a quote here from Amandeep, who's pictured. She's a blind white cane user from Seattle, just talking about poverty in the blind community, which prevents many people who perhaps would want to take advantage of Lyft and Uber from being able to afford it. So just thinking about in your own community, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but are there Lyft and Uber available? Are there taxis? Do they come? And are there any wheelchair accessible options? Because chances are, unless there's sort of a subsidized program that's mandated or subsidized through a government entity, it probably doesn't exist. So we were sort of talking about the access piece of this, right? Like, how do you get places? How do you get that transportation need met? But I think the other side of the equation is, how do we make sure that the places we need to go are close enough to where we need to be, that transportation becomes less of a lift, less of a barrier, right? And so I am personally really excited about this sort of land use part of the conversation. How do we reduce the distances we need to travel? Because it has incredible potential health impacts, climate impacts, environmental impacts. And I think most of us would prefer to not have to travel far distances to get places, whether that's in a car or not a car, right? There's an image here. This is, I think, an image from Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I was for work at some point, and I was trying to get somewhere, and it was just this sort of desolate, super hot, no tree shade, suburban sidewalks on a giant suburban road, and there was a McDonald's play space. That was sort of the only environment that you wanted to be in. I think, part of this conversation is the housing affordability conversation. It's something we struggle with a lot in Seattle, a lot in all parts of Washington State now, is that the only place you can get housing that is affordable are these further out neighborhoods that are more sprawly, often lack sidewalks, often lack transit. And there's a quote here from Vaughn Brown, who's a disability advocate in Washington State, who says, "More affordability means moving further out. Moving further out means more limited transportation." So, question for you to consider is, where are the places you need to go? How far are they? Are there closer options? We asked in that same survey that I did the word clouds with earlier about, what determines where you chose to live. And it was interesting because, again, I thought cost would actually, float to the top of it, because I feel like that's something that we hear a lot. But actually, at least in the word cloud version, the most common words were around access to transit and access to the bus. Transit, transportation, access, bus, close are the big words in that word cloud. So really, I think people who cannot drive think very deeply about wanting access to transit, whether or not they can afford it. That's the question. I want to provide a more rural context too, because I know, in Minnesota, like Washington, has many rural communities, and I think it's important that we talk about transportation access, not just in an urban context. This is the community where my grandma lived, the one with the heart condition. It's called Griffin, Indiana. It still exists, hardly. But when my dad was growing up there in the 50s and 60s, it had a grocery store, a school, a pharmacy, a gas station, a cafe. Then Highway 64 got built there in the 60s, built right through it, actually. Not through the downtown, but right beneath it. And so suddenly, rather than sort of shopping locally, it became much more affordable for people to drive into Evansville, which is about 40 miles away, but still, more shopping options. And, that caused basically the decline and death of this downtown. And the population has not decreased in this county. But instead, people are just choosing to shop further away. And that works out great as long as you can drive. But once you can't drive, like my grandma, or I had toyed with the thought of moving back there at some points, and it's like I couldn't get any of my needs met. So what would it take to get more local services into our communities so that we don't have to travel that 40 miles into town? All right. I'm going to pivot now and talk a little about so there's some sort of big picture, problems and some of the things that we need to be thinking about to address them for non-drivers. How do we, create these less car-dependent communities? The last chapter of my book, and it's actually my favorite chapter, really gets at the question of how do we make this change happen? What will it take for us to get there? And for me, this is actually, I think, the work that I'm most excited about because it gives me the most hope in the future. It's about making sure that we have people in the room who have that experience of being non-drivers, who understand what it's going to take. Because I think ultimately that's going to allow us to shift the conversation and to really create the change we need. And there's a quote here from Dr. Beverly Scott, who she led a bunch of different transit agencies around the country. She's sort of like a grandmother of transit. And she said, "It is not a matter of altruism. It is not a matter of, I'll make 2 tables here, and you're going to be at the little table, and we're going to be at the big table. This is a matter of responsibility on the part of those who are being good leaders and stewards." So how do we create this space to get voices in the room that haven't previously been able to even get there? And there's an image here on the left of Abby, who I mentioned earlier. She's the blind non-driver. She's leading a walk-roll audit in Vancouver, Washington, with some of our state DOT folks, telling them what it felt like to cross the highway interchange they just redesigned and we're very proud of. And it was not actually so easy to use if you didn't have vision. So two concrete pieces of how to get more non-drivers in the room is one is to hire non-drivers. And in Washington State, there's two pieces of legislation that I'm actually actively working on right now through work. One of them is around driver's license requirements. Oregon and California have passed laws in the last couple of years that prohibit employers from requiring driver's licenses unless driving is an essential function of the job. And that's something we're trying to do in Washington State as well. Because we see this all the time, even at transit agencies, even at like for ADA coordinator positions at transportation departments, it'll be this default HR setting where it'll be driver's license required. And that means that a lot of people who don't have that driver's license for whatever reason are excluded from being considered for these jobs. And sometimes it's an explicit requirement on the job. Sometimes it's just within the application system. Like I've applied for a job at our Seattle Public Schools to be a CFRES to school coordinator, right? And it was part of the back end of the application. So my application got screened out before anybody even saw it because I didn't have a driver's license. That's an important step. So you get that expertise of people who ride the bus, who bike, who walk, who roll places, helping to shape our agencies and our institutions and make them work better for all of us. The other piece is making sure that we have the voices of non-drivers in rooms where decisions are being made about transit in particular. We see in Washington State, our transit boards are governed by elected leaders. But to be an elected leader, you pretty much have to have a driver's license, and that the requirements to sort of be a whole bunch of different places really fast preclude anyone who can't drive from being considered as a serious candidate in pretty much every part of our state. And so what we end up with is these transit boards where the only people on the boards are people who are too busy to ride transit. And they don't, not that they don't care, some of them really do care about transit, some of them don't. But they don't have that day in, day out experience of what is needed to make a system better. And so we've also been working on legislation to add a voting seat for transit riders onto our transit boards. And there's an image here of an elected official who was supporting us in the legislature last year, testifying on this legislation. And he says, most of our board members are not frequent transit riders. We recognize the direct stake that riders have in public transit. So that's another place to start thinking about how can you add those voices into places where decisions are getting actually made. No little kids table, actually the big kids table. The final opportunity I want to challenge you to think about, and I know that many people in Minnesota have already taken this on and thought about it, is the Week Without Driving Challenge. And this is a challenge that we launched in Washington State in 2021. And we launched it as a way to educate elected leaders about the experiences of being a non-driver. And since then, it's become a national challenge. This year we had participation, I believe, from all 50 states. There's an image here of different logos from different organizations all over the country who participated. It's now organized in partnership with America Walks. Ruth Rosas there is the National Week Without Driving coordinator. She's a tremendous organizer and has done really fabulous work to bring this challenge all over the country. I'm going to show you a quick video of some highlights from the Week Without Driving this year. And on the right, there's also an image of Toledo. And I share this because I'm hoping next year someone one-ups this, but they actually wrapped a whole bus with a Week Without Driving wrap, their transit agency. It was pretty awesome. I got to see it this fall. So I'm going to share a quick highlights video about Week Without Driving, and then I'm going to ask you in this sort of last interactive part of this presentation to share, if you have participated in a Week Without Driving, great, what your experience was like. But more importantly, if you were to experience in a Week Without Driving in the future, what your experience would be like. So you can think about that while you watch this video.
27 News Time 642. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be a non-driver in the city of Madison, now's your opportunity to figure it out.
Are you ready for a challenge? All you have to do is go a week without driving.
The Week Without Driving is really a chance for elected officials especially, but everyone, to experience the transportation systems we've set up from the perspective of the 40% of Madison and Fitchburg residents who don't drive.
It's about walking and rolling in someone else's shoes. The endeavor aims to broaden understanding and empathy to the barriers everyday non-drivers face.
I'd love to hear your stories and experiences about how you get around Lexington.
Well, say you drove to work today, or maybe you needed to make a quick stop at the grocery store. No problem, unless you don't drive in a car-centric society.
Where people live and where they work is part of that challenge.
Should my time be worth as much as someone who drives?
Disability Rights Montana received numerous quotes from their clients about not being able to drive. Eileen from Northwest Montana said, quote, "Doctors and specialists are 90 miles away. I have to save for months to afford the travel costs and have delayed cancer care because of it."
I really feel it, Tarda, it's critical that more of us understand the transit system and what it means to be a non-driver.
I'm excited for the Week Without Driving because I think for generations all over the world, we've been trained to think that having a car equates to having freedom. But actually, being able to live and exist without a car, that's a whole other level of freedom that I think this Week Without Driving will allow people to experience. And some people have never thought about freedom in that way before.
All right. Well, thank you all. I'm going to turn it over to you for questions, but also to begin with, the first question for you from me is, Week Without Driving, what was it like? What would it be like if you were to try to get around your communities without driving for a week?
I'm going to turn it to Eric to call on some people.
Great. I was just going to first say thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you to the partners who helped make this happen. We got Sierra Club in the room. Isaiah is here. We have 3 sitting city council members with us tonight. We have somebody who ran for city council, maybe next time, Lauren. We have a former city council member, never again, Michael. And we have some of the best and brightest medical minds in the world here. And so I think we have the potential in this city to kind of have the sort of impact in bringing lowering the barrier for non-drivers, both people who don't have an option and those who are kind of choosing not to drive. But yeah, thank you all for being here tonight.
Yeah. Thank you, Rochester.
But to Anna's question, would anyone like to kind of share their experience or kind of what they would expect their experience to be for participating in a Week Without Driving?
Yeah, so I bike to work, I bike everywhere, every day. And a lot of the problems here is that people don't know how to drive around cyclists and people who are trying to get by without cars.
Yeah.
And so you have to be a very defensive cyclist. The bike lanes are often not cleared. So like today, biking here, the bike lanes were covered and I couldn't use them. And in the last 2 years, 6 medical students have been hit by cars at Mayo. So it's a problem. And so safety is obviously a concern in this community. And so that's one of my experiences. It's kind of scary.
Sounds very, very stressful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I was shocked in Minneapolis today how many cyclists I saw out riding in. It's really cold, and also just the amount of ice that people still have to navigate, and how treacherous that is. Yeah. I'll also take other questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, I want to share. I think I spend many weeks without driving when I'm in town, but I can relate to the question on what's the toll of asking for rides, especially longer rides. 2 friends that I really had only known for a short period of time rearranged parts of their days to help me out. And there was the cost of the hotel, repairs, and while I was staying over with my questionable car, I needed contact solution, and so I had to walk from in an inaccessible area to a store to buy contact solution. And I was walking over a highway on a cold night in Wisconsin, and I just played the most Midwest emo playlist and maybe shed a couple tears, I'm not sure. But I think it is isolating and is part of maybe a rural experience, and Midwestern experience, and with some city exceptions, to have that struggle of crossing a large parking lot or a big highway.
Totally. No, I mean, so much of our country, right, is that way. And I think, New York City really is this beautiful exception. And I feel really lucky that I got to live there and sort of understand that it's possible to live a place where like the majority of people don't drive, and you like get directions to a doctor's office and they come in the form of the nearest subway stops, right? And it was, coming back, like so much of the rest of the country is just centered around driving as the only form of access, that it can feel hard to not have those choices. Yeah. All right. Any other questions or anyone else want to share?
Electric golf carts.
Yes.
Is there a place for electric golf carts in the future for certain people who have difficulty on bikes?
I hope so. And I mean, I think they're a great alternative for cars. So one of the people, I wrote an article, it's up on Streets MN, about e-bikes and e-bike access, but one of the people I interviewed for that, her name is Ivy, and she has nystagmus like I do, but she's older than I am, and so her kids are in college now. They might even have graduated from college, so they're a little bit older. And she lived in rural, suburban, it's Oro Valley, it's outside of Tucson, very, very suburban, before e-bikes were widely available, and so she used a golf cart to get around. And she, with her kids, and she could kind of figure out how to like go through parking lots and never go on main streets. But I really do think they're a wonderful opportunity, especially the all-weather ones and, climates that are a little colder. I think they're great. And I think, I was actually just listening to a podcast today. If you all listen to Streets, oh my gosh, it's called The Break is the podcast by Kia. Oh my gosh, why am I spacing on her last name right now? But she's a reporter for Streets Blog, and she does a podcast sort of covering some of the articles she covers there. And this one was all about smaller, sort of the golf cart-sized e-mobility options and what it would take from a sort of a regulatory standpoint to make it possible for them to exist and be usable in more parts of the country. So I'm super excited about that. I think there's a lot of potential there. And a lot of potential access because they're so much more affordable than cars, more environmentally friendly and safer, and more accessible to more people for whom driving isn't safe. So, yeah.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, I don't understand why it seems like a lot of the bus system in many cities is, the buses are made on a gargantuan schedule, even though there are buses that some of them do get really full during peak times, and then there's these buses that it's the same size and they never get full, but they still go out on those routes. And having lived in different and visited other countries, they are so ahead in many ways, because they would use small minivans or very mini buses, and they would come frequently for whatever different times instead of using these gargantuan buses for the same kind of bus even though they're being used differently, when it seems like it would be a great idea to have small buses, and some of them even had they were wheelchair accessible, and you didn't rely on that gargantuan bus that sometimes isn't even used to full capacity.
Yeah, I've definitely heard this before, and I'm not, a transit planner. I have heard other transit agencies respond to questions like this around, that the most of their costs are labor costs, and so it doesn't really matter whether the person's driving a big bus or a little bus. The labor costs are really, what's driving the cost of it, and if they have to invest in a whole new fleet, it just doesn't pencil out. I would say, I am highly skeptical. So in my neighborhood in Seattle, we've had since 2019 a pilot going on with Via. It's one of the micro mobility providers that does transit on demand. And so there's an app, and you can request their minivans in this case, so that people don't need to have commercial CDLs. And they come and they pick you up and they take you within sort of this geo zone. It's maybe a 2-mile radius from my house. And it has been interesting. I think it generally takes way longer than walking by the time they come. And so unless I'm carrying something that is unimaginably heavy and I can't possibly carry it without the minivan, it's not worth waiting. And I think that so many of these sort of on-demand systems, it just doesn't scale because the more people that use it, that it just takes way, way longer, and the cost doesn't scale the same way that it does with, a fixed route bus where you can add more people without adding a lot more time and a lot of extra cost. So, yeah. But I know that there are places I think that are super low density where some of that might make more sense than running a fixed route transit bus. I don't think my neighborhood in Seattle is one of them, and I think we've proved that by the system just now, taking hours to get the thing to come pick you up. So, yeah. I want to go back to a slide for a second because I didn't have time to sort of this slide. So this was the slide that shows the word cloud of where people didn't get to go that they wanted to. And it really is like those social things, right? Friends, social meetings, concerts, or some shopping outside. I need to go through, and I'm actually in the process, it's supposed to happen this week, I haven't finished, is coding all these answers, and so I can actually see the real frequencies. Because with word clouds, if one person said outside and the other person said outdoors, it would show up as two different words and it wouldn't get bigger, right? So I'm in the process of coding this data, but I'm pretty sure access to the outdoors, as I was scanning through the answers before, it definitely is up there. I have a friend and a colleague who helped me do a lot of my initial work with Disability Rights Washington on transportation access, whose passion is access to the outdoors without being able to drive. Her work she's branding it's called Transit Trekker, and she's focused right now on Washington State, but is providing a lot of sort of guides and on how to get to nature using a combination of sort of rural transit and biking and walking. And so I think that is something that floats up to the top. And it is something that in our state, at least, it's, access to the outdoors is so heavily tied to having access to a car that I almost sort of like, I find myself sort of cynical about being outdoors because it feels so like tied to car ads and like, oh, you get your Subaru and you drive to the mountains and go hiking. And it's like, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? We used to have rail that ran up into the Cascades, ski trains, right? And we took out that rail, and now it's a lovely rail trail. But unless you can drive, there's no transit now up to the ski slopes or to go hiking most of the year. So we have a few buses that run from a few places in Seattle up to like one or two trailheads now, which is great, Trailhead Direct. But we need more of that. That is such a great idea. And I think about that a lot when I'm out in rural areas and you see all those signs about like school bus stop and you're like, okay, but there'd never be a transit stop out here. And yet we have figured out how to provide school bus service. I don't know of it going that way, like school buses. I'm sure now with all the privacy concerns, like it would probably be a pretty big lift to get other adults onto school buses. I know that there's also a rule, it's called the Tripper Rule, that prevents public transit from running buses that compete with school bus routes, which is pretty messed up. I think it's something put in by the school bus industry. Now that they're struggling so much with driver shortages, I don't think they'd care as much. But yeah, it's unfortunate that we have these two separate systems rather than integrating them into one more efficient system that then can really provide kids rides and train them how to use a system that they can use throughout their whole lives, right? So yeah, I think there's so much potential there in a big picture sense. That's really a cool story, though. I'm curious about that if it happens more places just unofficially. Yeah, and maybe, in a different time. Yeah, cool.
Thank you so much for coming out here tonight. And,
yeah, thank you all.